ნახტომებით. ჩვენ ცოტა არ იყოს მცირე შესვენებით ვაგრძელებთ ჩვენი სერიების ლექციების სერიას, რომელსაც ქვია კრიტიკა და კრიზისი და რომელშიც ცოტა ხნის წინ ჩვენ პროფესორ გიორგის არის საინტერესო ლექციას მოусმინეთ, ხეში შეიძლება პროფესორ გიორგის მოусმინოთ. უაღრესად საინტერესო თემაზე, რომელიც ეხება მოდერნიზაციას, მოდერნიზაციის ნახტომებს, სხვადასხვა ქვეყნების მაგალითზე და ბევრმა თქვენმა დაცული არის, რომ პროფესორ დერლუგიანი არის სწორედ ამ სფეროს ერთ-ერთი ძალიან კარგი სპეციალისტი, სხვა სფეროებს შოურის და სხვა სფეროების გვერდზე. მას აქვს უაღრესად საყურებლო და მნიშვნელოვანი ბიოგრაფია, ეს არის საბჭოთა ადამიანი დაბადებულთან დაშოში, რომელიც დატოვა და ახლობით 30 ასაკში, მანამდე მას ჰქონდა ესეთი აფრიკის მცოდნეობის ვარდა საინტერესო გამოცდილება, მოზამბიკის სპეციალისტია უფრო კონკრეტულად, მაგრამ ისწავლიდა ამერიკაში, გახდა ცნობილი ამერიკელი ძალიან განთქმული ამერიკელი სოციოლოგის პალესტინის მოწაფე და გამოაქვეყნა თავისი პირველი მნიშვნელოვანი პუბლიკაცია ძალიან, რომელიც 2005 წელს გამოაქვეყნა, ეს იყო ბურძიოს საიდუმლო თაყვანისმცემელი ჩეჩენ აჯანყებულზე, რომელიც ამას კიდევ ბურძიოთი მემარცხენე ფრანგი სოციოლოგით ინტერესდებოდა. ეს იყო ძალიან ცნობილი წიგნი, Times of Supplement-მა ის აღიარა 20 წლის წიგნად და ამბობენ ხოლმე, რომ პროფესორ დერლუგიანმა შექმნა ახალი ჟანრი, საერთოდ ესეთი მსოფლიო სისტემების ბიოგრაფია, ხო? მსოფლიო სისტემები ეს არის ის მიდგომა, რომელსაც ის და მისი ცნობილი მასწავლებელი ემანუელ ვალენსტაინი წარმოადგენენ, ეხდობიან და ფერნანდო ბროდელის და სხვათა მიდგომებს ხადიან. ამის შემდეგ გიორგი დერლუგიანმა გააჩარა შეიძლება პუბლიკაციების ძალიან სერიოზული პროცესი, მონაწილეობა მიიღო მრავალი კრებულის გამოცემაში, მათ შორის უაღრესად მნიშვნელოვანი და საინტერესო სოციოლოგებთან ერთად, როგორც კალკუნი, იგივე იმანუელ ვალენსტაინი, მაიკლ მანი და ასე შემდეგ, მათთან ერთად მან გამოსცა წიგნი აქვს თუ არა მომავალი კაპიტალიზმს. გარდა ამისა, ამერიკულ გამოცემას პოლიტიკოსკაიას ცნობილი ჟურნალისტი, რომელიც მოგესალმებით მოკლეს რუსეთში. პოლიტიკოსკაიის წიგნის შესავალი ეკუთვნის მას ინგლისური გამოცემის და ასევე ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი გამოკვლევები იმაზე, როგორ შეიძლება გამოიყურებოდეს მსოფლიო ცივობის შემდეგ, ცივობის დასრულების შემდეგ, როგორც ამბობენ პოსტგლობალიზაციის ეპოქაში. ის დღეს არის პროფესორი ნიუ-იორკის უნივერსიტეტის აბუ-დაბის კამპუსზე, მანამდე მასწავლებელი პროფესორა ნორთვესტერნის უნივერსიტეტში, მოკლედ ძალიან გამორჩეული კარიერა აქვს გაკეთებული როგორც ამერიკელ სოციოლოგს. მიუხედავად იმისა, რომ ცხადია, რომ ის არის ერთ-ერთი იშვიათი ექსპერტი ამ სფეროში, რომელიც ასევე ძალიან დიდ ცოდნას ფლობს არა უბრალოდ საბჭოთა სივრცეზე, არამედ კონკრეტულად კავკასიაზე. ის წარმოშობით არის სომეხი, დამკვრის ამას ოჯახიდან, რომელსაც ძალიან დიდი კავშირები ჰქონდა საქართველოსთან, იკვლევდა ჩეჩნეთს და ჩრდილო კავკასიაში რევოლუციების და აჯანყებების მოძრაობებს. შესაბამისად, ეს არის იშვიათი მსოფლიო მასშტაბის სოციოლოგი, რომელმაც იცის კავკასიის გამოცდილება და არცნობული ვარ, ეს გამოცდილებას ერთად დავინახავთ და ეჭვმეპარება, რომ ინტერესის იქნება კონკრეტულად ამის მიმართ. მე მეტი აღარ შეგაწყენ თავს, რომ გადავხატო მადლობა კავკასიის შვეიცარიის აკადემიკურ ხსოვს, რომელიც მხარს უჭერს ამ ლექციების სერიას და სიტყვა გადავშე პროფესორ დერლუგიანს. So, Gheorghi, the floor is yours.
The presentation I'm going to make, like everything, has an important history. And its history probably explains something about the substance.
Is it better?
Oh, it's much. Now.
Past spring, several of my friends in Moscow began calling urgently, of course, because as it happened, the Prime Minister of Russian Federation, Dmitry Anatolyevich Medvedev, read my book and got excited to the extent that he wanted me to lecture to the whole cabinet of ministers. What I'm going to present to you is exactly the same piece, minus a few cutscenes. We just don't have time to dwell on the spontaneous modernizations in England and Netherlands. But this is for full disclosure that after presenting this at the retreat to the Russian government, I went to Kiev, presented it there, not to the government though, but to our colleagues at Polytechnical University. And now I tried my best to translate it into English for you. And except the last part, it proved too difficult to translate, and there are a few words in it, but we will do it together. What was the interest of Russian leadership at this moment? As I understand, of course, they're trying perennially to tackle the problem, which is the problem of the entire post-Soviet region. They want their country to be a great empire, a great power, strong and big again. In the Soviet period, this was called socialist construction, becoming superpower through this. What Professor Kotkin might better describe to you as the Soviet communist imperialism or revolutionary imperial paradigm. And then it collapsed. So there are many different, and majority of them are quite outlandish explanations for what happened. I will try to present my explanations in the perspective of comparative historical sociology. We go into the record, historical record, because that's the only source of evidence we really have. And we try in a systematic fashion to compare the instances that we consider today successful development, successful modernization, some people would say, and the instances of failure as well. They're very important to understand how in the modern world today some countries became rich and some countries became poor. And why do they stay poor? This is the very essence of the classical foundational interest in modernity, going back to at least Adam Smith, to Malthus, Thomas Malthus, to Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim. They all lived in the era when Europe became dominant in the world. They took it pretty much for granted because they were European at the time. I will try also to undermine, I think it's quite healthy, to undermine some of the received wisdoms, what we take for granted. We will see through this. They spoke about markets and industry, of course. They spoke about the new demographics of modern era. They spoke about capitalism or the values. The problem with all those explanations is that, first of all, they were formulated very early on, when the West, even in the times of Max Weber, is still unique. They would dismiss Japan probably, even in the early 1900s. And these are very general theories infused with the optimism of 19th century. This is evolutionary optimism, which is of course validated at the time in the theories of Charles Darwin. Evolution, everything goes through stages, everything becomes more complex, everything grows to the higher stage. But then it becomes, in the mid-20th century, it becomes very much reduced to two paradigms. What I would call is essentially the same paradigm. The Liberal Marxist. This is the Cold War idea of modernization. After 1945, United States of America and Soviet Union emerge as two remaining superpowers, both of them believing that they can bring the rest of the world to their version of modernity. And I think you might have some fun with this list of their essential recommendations. they agreed on so much and they so loudly disagreed on a few details that we take the disagreements as the substance of debate. But in fact, I was defeated here with one very juicy Soviet-era expression. The equivalent of traditional society in the West, in the Soviet parlance, would be feodально-байские пережитки, just feudal holdovers. So we defeat the feudal holdovers. Who are we? We are the middle or working class, the proletariat or the middle class. They lead progress of their countries to the triumph of market, of land, modern economy. It becomes, the political system becomes a liberal or people's democracy. It's a consumer or всеобщее благосостояние, well-being society. It's characterized by urbanization or стирание отличий между городом и деревней, as they would say in Soviet times. And of course, both presume that through technology, through all this development, the world is going to reach advanced stages of capitalism or develop развитой социализм. I like the phrase from Pierre Bourdieu's book on distinction, where famously said that the most tenacious orthodoxy does not come alone. It comes in a pair, where you must make a choice. You are there or here. And people ardently believed in either one and fought for them. But I'm going to speak about modernization in a slightly different vein, and here my theorist is present somewhere there, Professor Stephen Hawking. Modernization as geopolitical imperative. It's either you have modern guns or you don't. And if you don't, if you have no capacity to produce machine guns in the modern age, those who have would come without asking because you're a barbarian country. And we have plenty of such examples. As of roughly 1800, which is just 200 years ago, historically it's not that far back, Korea and Japan would look much the same. Only a century later, 1900, Korea would become a colony of Japan. So these are very big questions. Who would become the metropole of the new world, of the new modern world? Who will become their colonies? What is incredible about capitalism, it's in a very dynamic historical formation, to the extent that it's very difficult even to speak about evolution of human societies in the last 200 or 300 years. It's a continuous revolution. Yet, the order which had emerged about 300 years ago remains very much intact. The English-speaking countries continue to dominate it, as they did since the 18th century. Why is that? Now, let me show you what was the real dawn of modernity, the post-medieval societies. If in the 16th century the Economist magazine had existed, first of all it would be probably published in Arabic or Chinese language. And if we could poll the experts of the epoch into the global trends, project us, the global trends of your brilliant 16th century, they would all tell you, that thank God, this medieval strife has finally ended. Nomadic invasions have ended, plagues are ending, and the horrible domestic strife caused by different interpretations of religion, what they call heresy at the time, they're also ending. Thanks to the new technology of gunpowder and the new much bigger bureaucracy collecting taxes to finance the gunpowder empires, we have a generation of new big powers emerging. First of them is, of course, Ming China, Ming Dynasty China, emerging from the Mongol yoke, as they call it, very much like the Russians. But look also at India, the size of India. For the first time, there is one single empire encompassing almost the entire subcontinent. We call them the Mughals, and Mongols. They are actually Uzbeks, claiming to be descendants of Genghis Khan. Persia, Iran, which hadn't existed as a single unit for 900 years previously, since the Arab invasions, is reconstructed at around exactly the same time, 1500, by the Shia sect of Ismail Safavi, who establishes a new dynasty, the Safavi dynasty. Iran becomes a real heavyweight in that world. But it's not only in the East, in Asia, this is happening. Look, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, really reconstructed the Eastern Roman Empire. So for the first time in almost 1,000 years, Roman Empire is back with vengeance. And in Europe, in Western Europe, if you think that this is the epoch of the genesis of capitalism, no. Actually, it is the epoch when a new big power emerges in Europe. We call it Spain, but it's not really Spain. Look how big it is. About a third of European continent is already Spain, but we should probably more properly call it the Habsburg Empire by the dynasty which unites it. They are reconstructing, self-consciously, the Western Roman Empire, or they think the whole Roman Empire. They're very Catholic, and they are very much armed, and this is of course without colonies. There is no Philippines on this map. There are no Americas. But they have these enormous resources from the overseas. Soon, this is mid-16th century, 1550s roughly, but Portugal soon will disappear, and it will continue expanding. There are a few troubles with the Protestant heretics in the north, with some pirates in the Netherlands and England, Francis Drake and the such, but Spain is dealing with that. A little more effort, and they will be there too. And where are they all by 1900? So this is really a geopolitical revolution. As Mahatma Gandhi famously said, it's marvelous, it's incredible and wonderful that a small island, England, could dominate enormous India, and not only India, almost the entire world at the time. How could that be? Instead of, if you endure, I could give series of lectures on theory, but I will bypass theory almost entirely. I will skip right away to the explanation which I hold, that most of the time standard theories of modernization are based on temporality. They are built around time. That there are advanced countries and they're the future of the backward countries. That the whole world consists of countries which are on the same track, very much like a train, where the locomotive is the advanced country of its age, pulling everyone and eventually bringing them to their level. The theory which I'm going to expose is called here world systems analysis. It's mostly about space, geographical space. The difference between the rich and poor countries is not that the rich are ahead of the poor, but the rich are in the center of the world, which they have created. The center where intersect the commodity chains, where the most profitable industries are located, where therefore it makes sense to displace human labor with machinery, because human labor is way too expensive there. And it makes also sense to install democratic institutions, because otherwise the elites can inflict too much damage on each other. It's better to settle than to fight. They come to this realization. So democracy emerges as a mutual non-elimination mechanism. So we have three zones there. The central zone is quite small, it's the core. Well, I drew a little star there. As Fernand Braudel, the classical French historian, said that in the core, the sun shines brighter. There is a very large zone of periphery. Colonial and semi-colonial countries, the countries which are poor, underdeveloped, and so forth. But there is a very important zone. I'm not going to speak about either core or periphery today at all, for the lack of time. I'm going to speak about semi-periphery. It's a very interesting zone where the orbits are elliptical. The countries are coming kind of closer to the core, and then they pull back. Russia is a classical example. Once in a while, they get modernized, which means they move closer to the core. So when they ask me when Russia is going to be modernized, it was 3 times at least in the past 500 years. So they'll explain, and then it moved back. It recoiled closer to periphery. This is what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to present this. I don't believe that you will digest pure theorizing, so everything will be presented with pictures. Two classical failures, Poland and Ottoman Empire. Two classical success stories, Prussia. It's Prussia, it's not entire Germany, it's Prussia. And Japan. We had a big argument with economists about this. They would ask me, so what about Sweden? Or what about Taiwan and South Korea? Sweden, the whole Scandinavia, Austria, northern Italy, this is the larger area of Germany. As well as, of course, South Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong, this is larger, the near abroad of Japan. Some of these countries were directly under Japanese control for several decades. Some were caught beyond the direct control, but still very much in the Japanese sphere. Finally, I will have to speak about the empire which is the nearest here, which is quite indicative in itself, Russian Empire. Indicative because it is not in the roster of the 16th century success, and yet it is not in the roster of the 20th century failures. It does better than Turkey and Persia, and we should be quite surprised, because remember the original map. How big was Spain, how big was Persia, and it is still big. It is one non-Western country which remains, one empire which remains and survives for the 20th century. And since we are in Tbilisi, I took a deep breath and I decided, okay, and then I will try to say something about Georgia. You will forgive me and correct. Now, I need help because we need to get, they're pretty big files. How did I get into the next part? From sea to shining sea is expression, of course, from the Bible, but there is also the Polish period expression. Poland is second largest, at some point in its history, it's the second largest territorial, largest state in Europe, and then it disappears entirely. What happened? This is a classical puzzling failure. And when I presented in Russian audience what makes Poland particularly important to Russians, these are the Slavs who are not Russians. I have an article in Russian called Extremely Western Slavs. It is also quite interesting, it should be interesting to Georgians, because among the East European countries, this is probably the closest in social structure and political culture, as just to Georgia. So here is this big Poland, Lithuania, or as they call themselves, Rzecz Pospolita, which means republic. It is a republic, but the republic only for aristocracy, for the top 10% of its population. Look how large it is, but where is its navy? Where are the industrial centers of this humongous state? In short, it's not at all like Russia, so you can see it borders on the west. It trades with Holland from the 15th century massively. It has Latin alphabet. It belongs in the realm of Catholic civilization, definitely. It has Copernicus. Right? It can boast very successful participation in European warfare. Poles delivered Vienna from the Turkish siege, Jan Sobieski. Or if you ever visit Washington, D.C., pay attention whose statues are there in front of the White House. There are no Russians and there are no Georgians, unfortunately, but there are Poles there. The fighters for American independence. And of course it has a very libertarian polity, the famous Rzecz Pospolita. As I said, and notice this, 10% of the population are ennobled in Poland. It's the Szlachta. In England, at the same time, it's less than 0.5%. After all, how many nobles could the peasants feed with their corvée labor and with their contributions? Сколько генералов может прокормить мужик? Russian Empire would have 3% ennoblement. It's a lot. Can you guess what would be the Georgian rate of ennoblement before 1917? 7% actually. Well, the problem is that it's difficult to calculate. We'll have to go through Tiflis and today's Gubernia, but in the city of Tiflis, it will be 17% in the 1890s. It's beautiful, wonderful Polish cavalry. Maybe you have seen the great Polish films, Ogniem i Meczem, and by sword and fire, Pan Volodiyovsky, and so forth. They're great in making historical films about themselves. And they are, of course, so beautiful that even Rembrandt, this is Rembrandt, as you recognize, the painting by Rembrandt, it's a Polish magnet. Look at the type. And yet, this is another famous painting. Polish aristocrats are bowing to the German and Dutch traders. Because Poland produces wheat, primarily wheat and other grains, buckwheat and rye, which they export. Have you ever wondered, not only rye, Netherlands is famous, and Belgium are famous for their beer. And for beer, to make beer, you need hops, right? And where could they grow all that stuff? Netherlands is a swamp. So it is all imported from, the raw materials are imported from Poland. But the Polish Szlachta do not control the terms of trade, and they don't care. What they really care is to dress up, to drink expensive foreign wines. It's a crisis of overconsumption, if you wish. They mortgage their estates in order to show off against each other, in order to buy individual, look at that, these are individual weapons, while the naval ship is a collective weapon, and a cannon is a collectively operated weapon. But there is no artillery and there is no navy, but there is great swordsmanship in Poland, famous swordsmanship. As early as 1748, Montesquieu already says famously about Poland that the country would be better off if nothing grew from its soil, because they are in direct dependency. Let me show you how it works. So this is a classical periphery core commodity chain. So serf peasants, who are some kind of Ukrainians, Belarusians, maybe a few Lithuanians and Poles themselves, cultivate with very rudimentary devices their land. They work up to 6 days a week on their lord's field. Then the lord, of course, himself is not going to collect all those dues, so that's why they hire Jewish intermediaries. Having your banker or your financier who is not a member of the ruling elite religion actually makes a lot of rational sense. Rational choice modelers would immediately show you how this works. The peasants, of course, hate the intermediaries. The lords protect them to the extent that they can rely on these intermediaries. But there, the commodity chain doesn't end, because grain is brought to rivers, and by barges, it's brought into big towns. If you visit Danzig or Gdansk, Memel, Revel, Tallinn today, you will see that the seafront, the port, is lined with large warehouses. This is where all this grain is stored for the export. But who does the exports? German intermediaries collect the grain, they're wholesalers. Still, they don't have the shipping. They don't control the shipping and banking systems. The Dutch do. This is the part which I cut, sorry, explaining to you who subsidized Vermeer and Rembrandt, who paid for all the incredible efflorescence of arts in the 17th century. Have you ever wondered why the Dutch, such a small place? Or look at the Russian flag. It mimics, to this day, it mimics the Dutch flag. The same colors, except the orange becomes red on the Russian flag. So why is that? And then, of course, Sweden. Sweden is, in Russian there is a very good expression for it. Занимаются крышеванием. They offer geopolitical protection, because Swedish Navy controls the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic Sea is quite easy to control, it's enclosed, and it's very important, because it's not only the beer in Netherlands. Have you ever thought, like, the caravels of Columbus had to be built from lumber? Where does this lumber grow? In Europe. It's in places which today are called Finland and the Baltic states. So they are very important, strategically important supplier of raw materials, but very little of profits is left in this area. So you can see that in the core,
in central zone of world system. You have high profits, you have a lot of skilled labor and high technology of the time. The high technology of the time would be building ships. The Dutch were great, they pioneered 200 years before Henry Ford, they pioneered assembly line construction. They were building their ships in 3 months because they were ordering their lumber pre-cut to certain sizes already at the point of harvesting, dried there, and then in Amsterdam they would just boom, 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 they put together, and here is low-cost, very automated ship. They were the best in the world at that time. Paul Bert, who in the 1660s was finance minister of France, reports to Louis XIV, his great king, Your Majesty, your fleet is splendid. It has 1,000 ships. The Dutch, however, have 17,000. In a mud hole. How could they? Well, you see how. They are benefiting from very primitive technology and coercive labor in the periphery, in places like Poland. And of course, labor is controlled by the Schlachter, who are fed quite lavishly through the import of luxury goods. So if you think, let me get back, one very important thing, of course, in authoritarian countries like Russia, this sounds like death knell. They say, all right, look at Poland. It was a democracy. Democracy for at least the top 10%. So democracy doesn't work because Polish Schlachter stopped paying taxes to the central government. Why pay if you can enjoy it yourself? Very simple, rational choice, expectation. So you have to have strong hand. Okay, let's see how a strong hand works. This is Mehmet Ali Pasha, or Muhammad Ali, as he's called in Egypt. Khedive means viceroy, namestnik, for the Ottoman Sultan. He's often compared to Peter the Great, to Peter the First of Russia. And as we will see, he is indeed quite similar in many respects, except that he's a whole century later. See the dates of his life. Long life. So what happens is, as you know, Napoleon Bonaparte and the French invade Egypt. It's a very important moment. Notice, that before modernization spurts, you have what I call stryaska in Russian, or external shock. Somebody who is much more developed, someone who can manufacture those modern weapons, invades your country and shows to you the great advantage of modern military force. So this is exactly what the French did in Egypt, but Egypt got very lucky. The French came, then came the British, they chased out the French, and then the British left too because they were chasing the French all around Europe for the next 15 years. So Egypt was left alone. And Ottoman Sultan from Constantinople dispatches a slave officer. He was a Mameluke himself. He was Mehmet Ali Pasha, was of Albanian origin. He's ethnically Albanian. And the first thing he does, he convenes all the Mamelukes, the ruling elite. Do I need to explain what are Mamelukes? Because there were Georgian Mamelukes too. You probably know. Okay. So he convenes the Mamelukes of Egypt. Then they bolted the doors and killed them. They so much impressed the Europeans that, as you can see, the painting, I think, is in the Louvre. This is what in the language of social science we call the problem of collective action solved. Now Mehmet Ali Pasha can rule Egypt. And he starts ruling. Two favorite pictures. The other is Russian Tsar Peter the Great, of course. But look, this is Egyptian painting of Mehmet Ali Pasha building his navy in Alexandria. What is so funny? Do you find something funny? Something improbable about this picture? The sails. Look at the sails. The ships are standing moored in the harbor with full sails, as if they were sailing somewhere. But this is imagination of the nationalist painter, of course. So here, Mehmet Ali builds his splendid navy, and he's helped by whom? So it's a no-brainer. If the British are going to dominate the world after the Battle of Waterloo, to whom do you go for modern technology? To the French. Well, it's because they have the technology and they have lost the war, so they want to compensate at least somewhere in the periphery. You buy cheap from the French. And that's how it looks. There is a government with Western experts. They start building. It's an orgy of material construction. They build so much. They sent wave after wave their students to be educated in French military academies, universities, in École Polytechnique, and so forth. So this is already the grandson. Look, does he look to you very Turkish, except for the fez? Right? You know, they're already pretty westernized. You know, this is a ruler of Egypt. You know, this is another one, Mohammed Pasha. And he gives opera house. You know, of course, Verdi's Aida. Do you know for what occasion was it commissioned? It was commissioned by the Khedive of Egypt for the opening of his prestigious opera house in Cairo. Of course, at this point, Russian ministers in the cabinet start shivering, remembering the Olympic Games in Sochi, and so forth. Egypt had railroads before Scandinavia, but their railroads, they have locomotives. They're not building their locomotives, they buy them, mostly from England. But the locomotives are running next to the Nile River. What do they carry? Can you guess? Why do they need so many railroads? They carry cotton. How do they pay for it? You know? So what does Egypt produce? Well, Egypt can grow almost anything. It's the Nile Valley, after all. But Egyptian cotton is one of the best quality cottons in the world to this day. And of course, the Industrial Revolution in Europe is based at that time on textiles industry. Textile industries require a lot of cotton. They have insatiable appetite for cotton now. There is a great book now, World History of Cotton by Sven Beckert, right, from Harvard. It's a bestseller right now in the United States, intellectual bestseller. The problem with cotton is that it's a very labor-intensive agriculture. It requires 153 days of labor, hand picking cotton, a year. It's a curse to the population who must produce it. But cotton is the source of hard currency for Egyptian governments. They want more and more cotton. And soon, however, they diversify. It's not, they do not stay with monoculture. They diversify. They start building with French expertise the Suez Canal. This is mid-19th century. How do they do that? They just bring a lot of peasants and they start digging with holes, literally, the Suez Canal. At least 200,000 of them died from disease and starvation. This is pretty much like the Soviet-built canals, but much worse. But, as you know, it's built. At the time, however, the ruling elite of Egypt remains mostly Balkan and Caucasian. They are Circassians. They do not induct Egyptians, or at least not very many of them. They keep the ruling elite to themselves. They're foreigners, they're still Mamluks. Mohammed Ali Pasha ruled Egypt for 42 years. He didn't learn Arabic at all. No need. They spoke Turkish. And then look what happens. Ever heard about the Navarino Battle? The famous battle which saved Greece. Greek rebellion for independence ended in near disaster because the Turkish Sultan ordered Khedive of Egypt. Khedive is, after all, one of his subordinates. He ordered to use this newly built navy to subdue the Greek rebellion. And of course they began doing it by the 19th century way. Today we call it ethnic cleansing. They massively massacred Christian population on the island of Chios. This produces revulsion in Europe. This is one of the first humanitarian international interventions. And Europeans asked who had the navy next to it? Russia. So Russian navy, and this is famous Ayvazovsky painting, of course. They destroyed the Turkish fleet, but it turns out the Turkish fleet, which was sank at Navarino, was actually Egyptian. That's the same fleet that they built in Alexandria. And then more blows. Of course, no autocratic ruler would tolerate his subordinates becoming richer and more influential. The sultans became worried about what their governors were doing in Egypt. They framed them. In Russian, the word is подставили. The sultan concluded a treaty of free trade with Britain in 1838. It's called the Baltaliman. Baltaliman is an area in Istanbul, which limited, it capped the import duties by 5%, no more than 5%, which basically allowed the British textile industry to inundate the Egyptian market. cotton is taken from Egypt to Manchester, transformed into cotton cloth, and cotton cloth is sent back to Egypt. Of course, Mehmet Ali understands what's going on. He tries to build his own factories, but his own factories, before they're up and running, are facing British competition, and very soon they go bankrupt. And as they go bankrupt, they still keep on borrowing. This is a long-lasting epic. By the 1860s, Egypt has another piece of luck. United States of America gets into a civil war, and the cotton of Alabama is no longer in the world market. The prices go up, very much like what happened with oil prices in the previous decade. Egypt starts building even more. They build a very impressive army. They conquer Sudan. They conquer what today is called Saudi Arabia. They control a lot in the Middle East. So you have an empire emerging in the Middle East. But in 1866, the United States of America comes back to the world market with a vengeance. The prices drop. In 1873, this is necessary economic history, there is a huge market panic in European capitals. People are trying, middle classes in Europe and richer people in Europe are dumping the government bonds of Egypt, but of many other countries, the Russian Empire, and the world economy enters into the epoch of deflation. You probably hear about deflation now, do you? Because this is the big fear of economists. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. Inflation is actually quite good to some extent, and the prices going up and up, but maybe wages are going up. But when every year things become cheaper, it's not good for the economy, it's not good for the producers. Deflation is where Japan has been for the last 20-something years, or zero growth. So the world is in deflation, and Egypt suddenly cannot refinance its foreign debt. So when you cannot refinance your foreign debt, what happens? They come and demand, if they can, and they can, they come and demand that you pay. First, Britain decided to repossess the Suez Canal, and they did. The French were outraged, they found themselves suddenly in bed with Great Britain, but what can they do? Egypt had defaulted on debt. And Britain and the consortium of international lenders demands that the government of Egypt must cut its budget. And they cut where the biggest expenditure is, which is the military budget. The Egyptian army is downsized 75%. This produces a rebellion. Colonel Urabi, who is ethnic Arab Egyptian, raises the first nationalist revolt. So let's overthrow these Mamelukes and let's fight for the country. What happens is Great Britain sends the gunboats, and this is for the 20th century. This picture is not very impressive, but for the 19th century, when first of all combat photography is new, and second, of course, when people haven't seen the effect of modern cannons on civilian buildings. This is Alexandria, what it looked like after the landing of the British Navy and Marines. They arrested Colonel Urabi, sent him to Ceylon, where he would die 20 years later. And what Britain did, actually, which is very curious, they never formally annexed Egypt. They allowed Egypt to be Turkish. Turks are so weak, after all. And this is the famous phrase from Lord Salisbury, Foreign Secretary at the time. We do not govern Egypt. We govern the governors of Egypt. So very brief summary here of in policy circles they would want to take out. So in Poland, Lithuania, you have low yield, very primitive agriculture, but it's low profit. That's why it's very coercive. But so what? You have libertarian oligarchy of magnates at the top. No towns, because there is nobody to invest and there is nothing to invest, and why invest? Everything can be purchased from Netherlands and England. And the state in the result is started for taxes. By the 18th century, Poland becomes a geopolitical plane between Russia and Austria. It's divided because Poland has beautiful cavalry and swordsmen, but no artillery park, and it cannot afford a navy. Ottoman Egypt, well, they wasted a lot of money, they did lots of things right, perhaps, but they fell into the debt trap, and a lot of it has, I often say that, world politics is not very much like chess. It's more like backgammon. What's the Georgian food? Nardin as well, yeah. So a lot depends on what kind of czar. You have to play it still, but a lot depends on your luck. Here the bad luck was that Egypt was modernizing a whole century after Petrine Russia, and by that time British Empire really did not want a strong power controlling the Suez Canal. Okay, next. Two success stories. Part 3. Germany and Japan. There are really not very many success stories. The problem with my discipline is that we are comparative historical, but how many comparisons can we really draw? Our history is quite limited. So, Russia is a very poor, small country in the middle of Europe. The pejorative name for it is the sandbox of Europe, Pisochnica, because they can grow hardly more than turnips there. But they find, during the 17th century wars of religion, a very interesting kind of use for their peasants. Instead of exploiting the peasants in the fields, they are conscripted into Prussian army, the famous drilled Prussian army, as soldiers. And Prussia becomes essentially a mercenary state. It fights the wars on behalf of others, mostly Britain. So Britain called Prussia the Continental Sword. Every year during the 18th century, Prussia receives £100,000 in subsidy from London. But of course, this is also what Russians, those of you who know Russian history know, Arakcheyev and Arakcheyevshina, this well-ordered police state. This is what Russian Empire in the 18th century and many others try to emulate. The shock is delivered to Germans by Napoleonic armies. How come these frog eaters could conquer Germany? Because they had better cannons, because they had already École Supérieure Polytechnique and so forth. And so the Germans decide to emulate French. Yes, why not? Emulate the enemy if they are successful. So they found the first real university. Oxford, this is my favorite kick at the competition. Oxford and Cambridge and Sorbonne were not real universities, they were religious establishments. For a long time, Oxford and Cambridge until the 1920s did not have engineering departments. They did not have labs. The first real university, modern university with labs and where professors were required to do research is the Humboldt University in Berlin. And more importantly, who are the students? Every officer, every official in German Empire would be required to have higher education. It's the first state to require higher education. And here are the results. This is a very short story of the Siemens Brothers. They're peasants. They're not von Siemens, they're Siemens. Simply. That's why there are so many of them as well, and sisters. Yeah. One of the brothers becomes military officer, a colonel. Another brother is electrical engineer, and he invents telegraph. So Colonel Siemens is called by his superiors in the Ministry of Defense, or Ministry of War at that time, of course, of Prussia. And he's ordered, my favorite part of it, he's ordered to become a private entrepreneur. Being a good Herr Obers, jawohl, here is the money. Your brother developed something very important for German military, so you're going to produce telegraph lines for us. And this is the foundation of the famous electro-technological empire. The first electrical lamp in Japan, produced in 1904, will be a Siemens. Telegraph lines in the Russian Empire since the 1870s are the Siemenses, and to this day. This is what Friedrich List, the famous alternative economist, the economist of non-free markets, would formulate as the Russian road, or the Prusski put, or the standard tools. I take it from Bob Allen, my colleague in Abu Dhabi. He's a great economic historian, I very much recommend. 157 pages in a very short book. It's indeed a very short introduction. And it's a delight to read, and it's very enlightening. Everybody was doing this in the 19th century. There are 5 steps, they're all kind of no-brainer. You have to have your own bank system. You have to have state-directed industry, because if entrepreneurs themselves do not produce enough steel, you tell them to produce, like Siemens. You have protection tariffs. You must have remember what happened with Egypt, Balta-Liman Treaty. you have to protect yourself against the English. I'm not going to speak much more about the United States here, but remember they had a civil war between North and South. The Southerners were plantation owners, slave owners, and so forth, who fought. First of all, let me ask you this. Can you believe that the most devastating war, the bloodiest war in the history of the United States, 600,000 dead, was fought just to liberate the blacks? What had to be the cause of civil war? Let me ask you the second question here. The first was more rhetorical, but let me ask you this. Between the slave-owning states and the free states, who favored free trade and who favored unfree?
Slave trade.
Slaves. Slave owners. Why? Because they didn't have industry. They have nothing to protect. They want their cotton flowing freely to England, and all they're very much like in Poland. And they want their luxury goods to come back tax-free, or duty-free at the time. And of course, this is something which northern states with their industry, which Boston, New York, and soon the Chicago area, cannot tolerate. Because these guys are taking the country into the South America world. The best thing which ever happened to Alabama was to be defeated in civil war. Because imagine, had they won the Battle of Gettysburg, what they would look like today. They would be a large English-speaking country with the level of development of Jamaica or Barbados, and probably with political structures of apartheid South Africa. Right? They were taking the Polish way. Now, here we can browse more rapidly. Japan. I just want you to note that the presence of the samurai class is the failure to adopt the Chinese model. Have you ever wondered why there are no samurais in China? Actually, there were in the first millennium, but they were subdued by the bureaucracy of the mandarins. But in Japan is kind of failed version of Chinese empire, and this happens to be their luck. They have the samurai, but not only the samurai. There is a very important article by Randall Collins. We know that they quote Randall Collins all along everywhere because he's so important and enlightening. It's called The Buddhist Road to Capitalism. Max Weber was patently wrong in claiming that Protestant ethic has anything to do with capitalist spirit. Because, well, look at all the Catholic countries. Look at Venice, at the height of its commercial powers. And of course, Weber himself was a very ardent Protestant. But Weber really got something very right. That capitalism does have something to do with religion, or the kind of the organization of religion in these countries. The first business corporations in medieval Europe were monasteries. The other religion which has monastic and very economic base is Buddhism. Buddhist monasteries play a very large role in building the foundations of modern market economies in China and Japan. Why? Because monasteries are not privately owned. Monasteries have a very long, theoretically indefinite span of life. They are bureaucratic organizations which are run by hierarchy, but it's a formal hierarchy. They are very modern and they are knowledge economies. Of course, no ruler likes their monasteries becoming too rich. So remember who nationalized, what happened to monasteries in Europe? Who nationalized them? Rulers like Henry VIII in England. It was a major privatization which actually released the knowledge and the germ of capitalism into the society. The same story in Japan. They nationalized, they suppressed under Lord Hideyoshi their Buddhist monasteries, and the result was, have you ever wondered, like this is of course Hakusai, famous painting, we usually take it for aesthetic value, but what was the price of it? Do you realize it was mass-produced? It's a print. Who were the people buying it? They were quite ordinary people, well, middle class, with some income to embellish their buildings. I told you already about the Buddhist origins of capitalism. The world's oldest corporation today is actually not in the West. It's a Japanese corporation called Sumitomo, and it's founded by former monks. But then nobody changes, and one thing which we learn from social evolution is that societies, and please notice this, we call it the least effort principle. Societies would not change as long as they can resist change. Because there are the elites, and the elites are already comfortable in what they are doing and what they are. They have the means to suppress knowledge of change and the impulses of change. Something must unsettle the elites pretty violently. There has to be a shock, showing that tomorrow you might not be the elites, you're losing everything. You are looking into a chasm. And this is delivered, of course, the famous, you realize that this is how Japanese depicted Americans. And these are American ships in Japanese imagination. Again, the role of American Civil War is very important in the 19th century. The Japanese were lucky. They were visited and then left alone for a while, and then the rest you know probably, at least from the film The Last Samurai. So you see they start building schools on German pattern. They start dressing like Germans because Russian authoritarian road to capitalism is very congenial to this samurai military class. And very soon, look, argued from the standpoint of Minister of Agriculture and Food that this is slave labor is actually very high cost and very low utility. It's much better to kill these people right away, and the first object of killing, of starving, were Poles. The Apolia Plan in 1939, Germany occupied a good chunk of Poland. So what do you do with the population? How do you introduce rationing regime, cartage system, or whatever? No, let's kill them. Was the first idea. What do you do with 3 million Soviet prisoners of war? What do you do with Jews in ghettos finally? We do not know where the Prussian road really leads because, fortunately, it was ended in 1945 in external conquest in both cases. Very interestingly, Americans allowed kind of the microchip, the brain of the robot, which Japan was. They allowed to stay in place. It's called MITI. This is the cover of the famous book about Ministry of International Trade and Industry. But before 1945, it had a better name. It was called the Imperial Ministry of Munitions. Имперское министерство боеприпасов. Because munitions, you realize, this is copper, and this is lead, and these are metals, this is chemistry, and this is also food. So this is the Gosplan of Japan. The original title of the manuscript, which Chalmers Johnson submitted to Stanford University Press, was From the People Who Brought You Pearl Harbor. But the editors begged, please, something more academic. And then, of course, the famous flying geese model of Kaname Hakamatsu. Japan no longer needs to produce every single short or silk stockings. So they begin dumping into South Korea, and now you know how that ends. What to do with Germany after 1945? The first reaction was by Henry Morgenthau, the finance secretary of the United States. It has a beautiful name, pasteurization. They wanted Germany to become totally deindustrialized, unable to produce a single tank, ever. The reaction came from Army General George Marshall, saying that I have these millions of Wehrmacht soldiers in prisoner of war camps. So what do I do with them? Kill them? Or release them into the economy where there are no jobs for them? So what do we do? And the result was the Marshall Plan. And the final. So this is when I asked my American students, have you ever seen a French car? Have you ever wondered why there are no Renault or Peugeot on American roads? Because they didn't matter. What mattered after 1945? What the Nazis, the former Nazi regime, and the Japanese, they had to become friends. And so special red carpet was rolled out to them. And finally, well, about Russia, I wrote mostly in Russian, sorry. But I will translate, I will be still speaking in English. So what happens? Ever thought why Russia is so big compared to other Slavs? Why there are so few Slovaks or Czechs and so many Russians? Because the Russians had the luck of being at the edge of the great steppe. Of course, for the first 500 or 600 years of Russian history, this was great misfortune, because they were attacked by all kinds of nomads. But then, once they received it, remember, going back to the beginning of my lecture, with firearms, it's actually a very interesting question why the Tatars did not adopt firearms in time, and they paid a very heavy price. They became part of the Russian Empire. Russians were lucky also to be isolated from the West. Poland was not. But Russians could not be reached by English and Dutch traders so easily. So here is the picture of the English delegation is trying to evaluate the investment opportunity in Russia. And then it has its own pre-modernization shock. Russian Empire under the first despot, Ivan the Terrible, grows so powerful that it extracted from peasants too much. They became too effective in taking away from peasants all their grain. The result was that inevitably, at some point in Russia, bad weather would happen, and peasants begin dying out, and the state begins to collapse, and foreigners intervene, and this is the famous Smuta, and this is, by the way, the Russian way out of Smuta, which is very much like Somalia or Afghanistan at the time. One of these guys, famously, is a butcher, Grazdanin Minin, and the other is a remnant from the old army, a mercenary, Prince Pozharsky. The butchers, the bazaris of Russian towns, pay the mercenaries to protect themselves like vigilantes against the Roman gangs, and eventually they start realizing that we can secure not only our area but other towns like Yaroslavl, and then why not march on Moscow? The big, remember that it's like Nardi, it's not like chess. What was the luck in 1612? Why the Poles and Swedes leave Russia and did not return? 30 years war was beginning in Europe, and a big confrontation between Catholics and Protestants. So Russia is very easy to summarize actually. There are three iconic leaders: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Lenin Stalin. All three, first, by terror and repression, monopolize the resources in the hands of the state. Then it's easy to oppress peasants. It's much more difficult to oppress the elite. But they succeed in oppressing the elite. They reform the elite into the new ruling class. They discipline them and they give them new ideology, very much like nomenclatura in the 20th century. And, of course, immediately they produce their first dissidents. So this is the liberal Prince Kurbsky, who wrote famous letters to Ivan the Terrible. and Protopop Avvakum, the leader of the Russian Old Believers, the Pochnik, or Patriot, as they would call him today. The second is, by now you should realize why they were borrowing from Holland, primarily. That's why. And the result is quite interesting, that Russia is so big because it happened to have Siberia, that Russia leaped forward in the 17th century, a whole century before the Turks. It managed to do that. And the result is that by the 20th century, this country is still very big. And it's the only non-European kind of agrarian empire which is still in the running. Japan will be catching up soon enough, but this is where Stephen Kotkin might tell you more. So Russia still has very expansive Russian empire, very expansive demography. This I can illustrate with examples from Mingrelia. So for instance, why peasants did not receive land in the 1860s in Georgia by most of the time, because too many elites, too little land, but too many peasants. What happens with the peasants in the Caucasus? They multiply massively in the 19th century. And this is choking the new industry, because when you have so much cheap labor, there is not much incentive to replace it with tractors. So somebody has to do that. And if I had more time, I would show you the pictures of the geniuses of Tsarist regime. They were real apparatny geni. That's part, of course, for the Russian government, and they love this story because they very sadly started. Well, you should see their faces when I showed them Durnovo, Witte, and Stolypin, and explain what happened to those three. Here, no pictures here. So, Prussian road failed in Russia. What remained, of course, Stalin, who is Witte сегодня, the big railroad builder. The rest is, I feel very embarrassed retelling all these stories in the presence of the author of Stalin's biography. But I will add something which is not in Kotkin's biography of Stalin. The Bolsheviks managed to create the state which Max Weber himself could not have imagined. They created a charismatic bureaucracy. Bureaucracy with an idea. At least in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, they still have a great idea. But they learn, of course, from Marx, they're inspired by Marx, but they learn literally from other Germans, from Bismarck and state building. That's why Georgia becomes a republic of the USSR. From Walter Rathenau, the great, the father of German industrial planning. And of course from General Erich Ludendorff, the genius of military planning in World War I. And of course Henry Ford with his conveyors. My favorite, since I spent so many years in Chicago, this is Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Those of you who ever seen the Russian State Duma, previously Gosplan, may recognize the building immediately. And this is even better, of course, especially in Armenia, very delicious in telling these stories. When Stalin looked around, his Politburo in the 1930s, maybe apocryphal story, but he looked around and said, well, now we build all those factories. We have to feed tens of thousands of workers during a bedly period, the lunch break. We have to do this efficiently, we have to do this scientifically, of course, like everything. And he looked at Kaganovich and said, no, Kaganovich is Jewish and it's not tasty food. We need an Armenian. And he pointed at Anastas Mikoyan, said, Anastas Mikoyan is going to be the narcom of Общепит, of Pishiprom, of food industries. Mikoyan literally, with a sack of money, went to meet with Henry Ford. And if you ever saw Soviet stolовые, with their zelený goрошек, green peas, with hot dogs, sosiski, this all comes from Henry Ford and from America at the time. This is really a modernization. But the problem is, with that modernization, is that already by 1941, it's proven not working enough. Of course, Kotkin would tell you, that this was the biggest invasion ever in human history, but nevertheless, what is very interesting, what is still a big puzzle to me, is that Stalin, by 1942, by the Battle of Stalingrad, begins to dismantle his own dictatorship. He has to, because he cannot micromanage such a large war. He has to delegate power and authority to his generals and to his ministers. And this power would never come back into his hands. this is the last great spurt forward, but have you ever wondered why in 1953 they finished Stalin with Stalinism? That's not me. Why they de-Stalinized after Stalin so immediately? Because how can you live, even if you're longer in Siberia? Today you are narcom, tomorrow you receive a phone call from Stalin at 4 a.m., you disappear with your whole family into the camp dust. Right, so this is what happens with the democratization begins with the nomenclatura. If you know anything, you had time to discuss what happens with democratization of Japan and South Korea. I could show how the leaders of the big chaebols, of the big corporations, were the first, the pioneers of pushing for more liberal democracy. Why? Because they want to live, and because they want to enjoy the fruits of their life privately, and they want their children to inherit, not just to be appointed by the finger of the dictator. So it looks like there were 3 cycles, and this is the moment when I would make a big pause and say, so do you think that Russia can make it again? No. Nobody can make it again, because all these tricks were based on oppressing huge demographic mass of peasants. And peasantry is what had disappeared. This is the greatest achievement of Soviet Union. Its peasantry disappeared by the 1950s. Those who survived became, well, basically us. They became educated urban middle classes. They became the people with low fertility. Of course, 1-2 child per family. And they became far more demanding than their ancestors. So the kind of Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Stalin modernization became impossible. Not only in Russian Empire, it became impossible almost everywhere else in the world. You no longer have the peasants for this. So what are you going to do next? The Soviet Union vacillated, Khrushchev and so forth, but let me get, since we are running out of time and I will have to march you through all this. Soviet Union, my favorite quote is from Valery Bunce, Subversive Institutions. By 1968, reforms were as urgent as they were impossible, because the nomenclatura denied themselves any advice from what is the function of opposition and think tanks that you have for the policy formulation going on. The Soviet nomenclatura, by keeping a very tight control over information, forced themselves to listen to the dissidents. Like it or not, but Shevardnadze was here in conversation with Gamsakhodin and Kostava, Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn were addressing, they're addressing not to the people, they're addressing to the rulers of Soviet Union all the time. Right? So they become the alternative, but they're not very practical alternative. They are more like prophets, or Yurodivy, I don't know what's the English for Yurodivy, saintly mad. Right. So why China managed to do it? So one very simple question which still remains. So why Soviet Union collapses, and in 1989 China, because they used force? Yes, in part, but look, in the 1970s, I'm old enough to remember that China looked like North Korea today. It has a it's one of the craziest communist parties in the world. They starved at least 45 million of their peasants, and yet they did not build industries. It's a failed Stalinist modernization state. China doesn't have, it's very important to notice what is not there. There is no Chinese equivalent of KGB. There is no Chinese equivalent of military-industrial complex. There are no national republics. There are autonomies there, and even they, like Tibet, cause enough trouble. But in general, it's just a very primitive communist regime, which is basically ready for the NEP of the 1920s vintage. And they're very lucky in this. In the 1920s and 30s, Soviet Union was, in the 1920s they were pursuing the NEP in the world economy, which was collapsing on itself. In the 1980s, Chinese, when they used the classical communist двухходовка, 2 moves. First, you face a rebellion domestically, you crush the rebellion. Second, you feed the rest of the population so that they don't think about rebellion. So this is the Kronstadt rebellion in 1921 in Soviet Union, and then NEP, New Economic Policy. This is Tiananmen rebellion in China in 1989, and then Chinese market reforms. This is Hungary after 1956, this is Czechoslovakia after 1968 rebellions. It's standard in a very, very standard communist state. Why China is successful? Well, because this is the time when Western capitalist groups begin outsourcing massively. They're looking for countries with cheap labor, where they could go. Soviet Union was very close, and Gorbachev has to be reevaluated. Soviet Union was actually very close to entering Europe in the late 1980s. This was the regime that, through its evolution, lost most of its teeth. For better and for worse. For better because it stopped killing people. For worse because it could not defend itself. It could not discipline itself any longer. This is the regime which was very much like, well, you realize how bloody were the origins of European Protestantism and how nasty could be the guys like Jean Calvin. But later it becomes very liberal, modern Protestantism. Communism was basically going by the same trajectory. And Gorbachev was irrational because he could not think rational. Nobody could help him to think rationally through his options. He was trying to exchange Soviet geopolitical threat and ideology for inclusion into basically German sphere of influence. Germany has always been the major counterpart and example for Russia. West Germany was very anxious to get rid of American tutelage. For how long could they be occupied by the United States? Germany wanted, and it's basically what they're doing now, of course, is creating a German empire under the tutelage of, under the umbrella of European Union. But Soviet Union as one single unit would have been a very welcome addition, probably, to this. For this, Soviet Union could have sacrificed Poland and the Baltic states because they would come back anyway. You know, what would they do between Germany and Russia? For this, the Soviet Union was ready to sacrifice its ideology. Who believed in that ideology anyway by the 1970s and 80s? For this, the Soviet Union, well, but of course, you know, we believe in Leninist ideology, but this Leninist ideology by the 1980s is nothing Leninist in it. It's something about humanistic values by that time. Basically, Gorbachev offered a deal that you accept part of our younger part, at least, of our nomenclatura, as co-owners of joint ventures. Soviet Union becomes capitalist. And then it collapsed. It collapsed by a very simple mechanism that the elites in Tbilisi after 1989, in Ukraine, in Armenia, the elites panicked. They suddenly realized that Moscow was not protecting them, and they could be eaten alive by their own population or their own rebellious movement. So they decided to fight in advance. You know, they preemptively. They took three great slogans of opposition. National sovereignty. You want national sovereignty? I become your national president. You want markets? Wonderful. These markets will enrich me and my clientele. And you want free competitive elections? When I'm already the president and my clientele control the economic resources, let's have elections. So these three slogans, which led to the restoration of neo-communist regimes almost in the entire post-Soviet area, but at a humongous cost. They lost the collective bargaining position to enter Europe. And they recoiled to periphery. So this is where we are today. Is there any more prospect? There are two things, you know, two predictions from the 1970s. One belongs to Randall Collins, whom I already mentioned, who predicted that in 1979 that Soviet Union was nearing collapse, like so many empires, from geopolitical overextension. It became too big to control such territory. So what usually happens in such historical situations? Either a rebellion domestically by the generals and the provincial governors who realize that the center is weakening, and they're in the best position to understand that the center is weakening. So they would be the first to try to defect in lifeboats, turning it into independent Georgia, independent Armenia, independent Ukraine, or they would be, if the empire preserves internal discipline and determination, it could be much worse. The empire would go for the last war of revanche. And it will be a very ferocious war. It will be like Rome versus Carthage in the Third Punic War. It would be like Nazi Germany, which is frightening example. They kept on fighting into May 1945. And it would be a confrontation with nuclear-armed Soviet Union. We thought that we missed that opportunity back in 1991. This is what Kotkin's book, famously titled Armageddon, averted. But was it averted? Could it be that we're coming back to it? Big geopolitical catastrophes typically do not happen in one blow, but in two. France lost first 7 Years' War, and then they had still to lose the Napoleonic Wars. Soviet Union lost in 1991. Putin now is trying to engineer revanche. It might lose it with devastating effect. So that's what is frightening. There is another possibility. Emanuel Wallerstein, as early as 1969, predicted that the next generation, of Soviet leaders would give up on their ideology, and as I described, would try to merge with Germany and Japan, would try, because they have very similar authoritarian ethos in their bureaucracies, they understand each other, and they're very well, they're mutually, culturally, historically compatible. And that would be the end of communism, but not the end of Soviet Union, because Soviet Union is a geopolitical platform which would be very valuable to the elites of this part of the world when bargaining with superpowers of its time. But they dropped it, they dropped the ball. Can they recover it? They might, if they ever manage, if the post-Soviet republics ever manage to put themselves back together, regain the kind of advantages that they had in the 60s, which means science, mass education, relative order, the supply of public goods, as economists would call it. But so far, we observe mostly the opposite. The public goods have been wasted, but the authoritarian traits have become more pronounced. So the prognosis in general is not terribly optimistic on this side. So is that all? Is it all history? As you can see, this is comparative analysis. All I try to do is to order many of the debates that we are inevitably having, to order it in a more systematic and historical fashion by trying to show you that Russia is not terribly exceptional, and yet it's unique as well. Unique because, unlike Germany and Japan, it was not defeated in 1941. It was defeated much later. The defeat might not yet be over. It might yet last. What are the prospects? We do not yet know. So this is where I would suggest, this is like nothing. Какой из выпадет, that we start thinking for different eventualities. Those, however, a good experienced player in backgammon always wins, because he or she would know what kind of combinations typically come and come to pass, and what do you do in such a situation. This is our duty, if you wish, as social scientists, to think through and help our societies to think through their options. Thank you very much. I think I spoke for too long already, so I will leave it.
Very much, Gheorghi, for this very rich and very interesting presentation. And now we'll open up the floor for questions and comments, please. I'm sure that this lecture will give rise to many questions. Please, Ken.
Okay, really it was very rich, but it also leaves some state of confusion, let's say so. So my question will be very general. So you started by okay, is it different now? You started by sort of rejecting or denouncing the classical theory of modernization, about modernization, that there is some kind of universal path of modernity, just England happens to be ahead and Zimbabwe happens to be behind, but everybody should go through this one path. So okay, that theory is rejected. But what is the alternative? Is there alternative theory? Because, or is it just Nardi, just luck? Because then there is this board system. somebody happened to be the core, somebody semi-periphery, somebody east periphery, but also that system seemed to be kind of logical or good-looking, how to say, elegant, between industrial revolution and sometime in middle 20th century, when we had, again, for whatever reason, some part of the globe became the core, some of the periphery, etc. And then it depends on your luck. When you are a country like Japan or South Korea or whatever, Zimbabwe again, what are opportunities, how do you manage to grasp those opportunities in time or maybe not. So is it just about luck? But on the other hand, also this framework of core and periphery, is it not crumbling a little bit? Because what is China now? Is it periphery, semi-periphery, or India? Not as spectacularly successful, but it's also, things are changing. So is periphery, is core going to be the core? I think people in the core are very concerned about maintaining the position of the core, and also periphery, some parts of periphery may be becoming the core on the one hand, but also periphery is going to the core physically in Europe, right? Syrian refugees or whatever. So what about this, your favorite theory of core and periphery? Will it hold, continue to hold, or it's going to other end?
Thank you, Pierre. You asked for, well, not even a lecture, because I cannot lecture on something much of which is not clear to myself. Emmanuel Wallerstein and Fernand Braudel always started the theory. They made the very breakthrough in the 60s and 70s with their original formulations. Since then, we have other theorists who suggest that we should try to compare world systems. Like, was there a core in the world system dominated by Roman Empire? Was there periphery? What was the definition of periphery? Perhaps. Can we learn anything useful by comparing, because we don't have so many comparisons, so what we have to do is compare existing world system to the past world systems. Can we get anything useful from that? There are many people who doubt, including Wallerstein himself. Because this world system seems quite unprecedented by historical record. There are, however, the big challenge is, of course, explaining East Asia, explaining China. In a sense, I deliberately try to bypass China because we spend too much time in China and because people believe that anything Chinese must be very, very complex, like their writing system. It must be very ancient. I tried deliberately to show that it's more simple than we think, that it just so happened. But it was a contingency waiting to happen. Because what is happening today, and with this final globalization, is that some of the pre-Western world systems are coming back. China is not an emergent economy, it's re-emerging. It has been an economic giant for at least 2,000 years. It had 200 years of very bad luck, 150 years since the Opium Wars of the 1840s. But it was kind of waiting to happen, that it would come back. India is also coming back. And then if you look at the world, maybe there's a hypothesis, that look at the world in the Emirates, I call it the world of Ibn Battuta. A Moroccan traveler in the 1300s could travel all the way from Morocco, hitchhike his way from Morocco to China and come back via Indian Ocean and Africa, the travels of Ibn Battuta. How could that be? Because there had existed several overlapping world economies at the time, or what Fernand Braudel called the wheels, the great wheels of commerce. The Islamic world centered on Isfahan and Cairo, maybe. The Indian Ocean world centered on the coastal areas of India, and of course China. And Europe was a rather marginal world system there. The debate is, does it make sense to speak of a single European world system in the 14th century, or rather about the Hanseatic Baltic system up there, and the Mediterranean system of the Italian city-states down there in the Mediterranean. If this could be a prediction, as some people like Janet Abdul-Wahab, for instance, argued, late Janet Abdul-Wahab, she died a couple of years ago, or as Giovanni Arrighi and Andrea Gunther Frank had argued that this could be kind of reminiscence of the future. Then, past China, which had preserved its entrepreneurial market potential since the 18th century. Notice why I started by mentioning China, Iran, and the very beginning, not to show only that the world was not predetermined to be Western, but also to show that these were modern empires, or early modern. They were not medieval or ancient. There was something intrinsically very new about the Ottomans in the 16th century, about the Safavids. And those commercial cultures, those were definitely market-based agrarian empires, because there were big markets there. They collected taxes more effectively through markets because peasants had money to pay more in taxes, and it was more effective to feed the bureaucracy and the armies at the time, like the Janissaries. Do you know the origin of word Janissary? Anybody who's Turkish here? Yeni Çeri, the new infantry, the gun infantry. Well, Russians copied Estrelasi directly, you know that. Ivan the Terrible was copying not from the West. The advanced example of the 16th century were the Turks. And to some extent the Spaniards, the Yenicheri, the Janissaries, and the Arquebuseos, and the Tercios of Spanish army. So if that is any predictor, then following China, we should indeed see the re-emergence of India and eventually Iran. And if the Middle East manages to put it back together, and it looked like Egypt vacillates and it could go back and forth, then we could see yet the re-emergence of the Islamic world economy. Because these are the regions in the world which still have, not peasants exactly, but they have the former peasants, they have large young populations which are coming into towns right now, into cities, which are ready to participate in industrial spurts. That needs always organizing. What I try to show in this presentation is that the successful examples were organized, sometimes serendipitously, but mostly very consciously, like creating the Humboldt University in Germany. It was not just by endowing the university, but requiring all officials to take classes in that university, creating the student body as well, creating the careers after that university. That all these efforts were predicated on the state fighting against its own elites, or disciplining the elites, because it's quite normal in the sense that it is to be expected that the elites would try to enjoy their life now, rather than invest in longer run projects. I was also trying to show that many of the recipes which can be deduced from the 18th and 19th century experiences are no longer applicable for the simple reason that previous modernizations have succeeded. We don't have peasants in many parts of the world, and even in China and in Iran, peasantries are disappearing now. And therefore, the old despotic models are not working. What could be working is yet to be seen, because the biggest problem, let me recapitulate very briefly, the theory of Giovanni Arrighi, Italian economist, was one of my great teachers, said that what the Dutch really did in the 17th century, they invented the way of protecting capitalism. Capitalism is an ancient thing. Unlike what Marx had thought, capitalism has been around since the ancient Assyrian times, and now we know this in great detail, actually, thanks to reading cuneiform archives. But capitalism was eaten up by the men of sword, by the men of direct military power. Capitalism became successful in the 17th century Protestant Reformation because it was the first capitalism with guns, the first capitalism which managed to protect itself. In the language of neoclassical economics, they internalized protection cost. The second big leap was British Empire, or Pax Britannica. It had internalized the protection cost, the cost of production. We know this as Industrial Revolution. The Dutch were mostly traders. They bought everywhere, from Japan to Brazil to Russia, and they sold everywhere. They did not produce very much except for their ships. The British were already massive producers. And but they ran into two big problems. One was market volatility. Remember I told you about the market crashes of the 19th century. And second, into the leftist movements and nationalist movements. They produced their own grave digger in the 19th century. They produced the working class. And it's movements that resulted in so many revolutions, successful or less successful. Somebody had to figure out how to internalize the transaction cost of capitalism, and that was the American achievement in the 20th century, which figured out both mass production and mass consumption, the Fordist regime. That was a great achievement after 1945, when war economies were reoriented in the core and also in the Soviet Union towards mass consumption. Yet, there is a big question now. Could this be replicated at the global level? In the 1940s, the need was to factor in maybe tens, maybe hundreds of millions of German, Japanese, Russian or Soviet workers. And that was done successfully by the 1950s. Now the problem is bringing in several billion people. And these billions of people are losing now what has sustained social life for the last 10,000 years. That means village. In the villages, peasants had very difficult but very structured experience. So they knew from birth to death who is taking care of what are the gender roles, what are the age roles, what are the expectations. What would be analogous mechanism at the level of billions of people squeezed into ever-expanding towns? Like Istanbul, with its population of close to 20 million. Like my favorite examples, in Nigeria, there are two towns you probably never heard about, Kano and Kaduna. There is also Sokoto and others. Each one has a population between 8 and 10 million people, estimates, who counted them. So what is going on in Cairo? What is going on in Mumbai and Shanghai? Some of them are managing to hitch themselves into developmental projects of People's Republic of China, and others are walking into Europe, despairing on their countries in the Middle East. So the question really is, what is the structure of charismatic bureaucracy? And American bureaucracy was also quite charismatic in the second half of the 20th century. The structure of charismatic bureaucracy, if ever, that can replace village community in organizing human reproduction. There is another possibility there, which is even bolder. Will it be a state? Yes, just a moment ago, I'm almost done. In the 20th century, anarchist alternatives looked mostly utopian and even ridiculous, because it was all about building stronger post-revolutionary states. It was about geopolitics. It was about the revolutionary emperors like Stalin, Mao, Fidel, Tito, and so on. But if future revolutions are kind of a future protest is less militarized, if we manage to get it more democratic, maybe libertarian and anarchistic recipes which were utopian through the 20th century could gain some currency. This is a debate. I have no answer to it, honestly.